Hey, good morning, Mark.
Good morning, Marcus. How are you?
So you just got back from Germany, right? Back to New York City.
Correct. I was in Germany. I woke up in Germany. Actually, I woke up in Germany 2 days ago, and then after four concerts at the Elbphilharmonie with John Zorn, and then I flew to Geneva for one night, and I flew back to New York here. I almost missed my train in Berlin. I mean, my flight. I've never missed a flight in my life, and I had to run so hard because all the trains were delayed. The trains going to the airport, something was going on. I don't know.
Yeah, what do you think about that new airport we got here in Berlin?
I mean, I think it was the first time I flew in and out of there.
Uh,
I only really, I only really walked. The first time I walked through. The second time I literally ran through. So all I can say is that I'm glad it wasn't huge. If it had been Amsterdam or Frankfurt, I would have definitely missed my plane. But yeah, I was on the train platform in Berlin, looking at the train time, saying 15-minute delay, 25-minute delay, 35-minute delay, and at some point I just said it's not going to happen, and I ran to a taxi and I took a taxi and I told the driver to drive as fast as possible. And I got to the gate 3 minutes after the gate closing, but they were still boarding, so I made it.
Very good. Yeah, I know that kind of situation very well. So Mark, it's kind of like wonderful to talk with you again because we go way back, like the dark ages of the internet.
Yeah, that's true. We go back to before the internet, maybe.
No, not really. But it was like the late '90s, I guess, right?
Yeah.
I'm not even sure if you were still in Switzerland back then or in
No, no, no.
Italy
I
or
left.
whatever.
I left Switzerland when I was 8 years old, but I lived in
Ah,
Italy at the time. I think when you and I first got in touch, I was living in Italy.
yeah. Which part of Italy were you in?
I was in Puglia, which is the heel of the boot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting. So you went from sort of like a, Swiss but northern Italian. Like what is what are your roots? Like is your father Italian, your mother, or both? Or
No, my mother is Swiss, and my father is Italian. So I actually don't have any Northern Italian. It's either Swiss from the German-speaking part or Italian from the deep south of Italy. So
yeah, that's a cool combination.
yeah.
So you to me you strike me as like one of the, well, I don't want to say few person people, that is not true, but one of the people who's really driven by music. Like you have like such a passion for music, and also in all its forms, right? And also from like all angles. You as somebody who makes music, somebody who you used to run the chain DLK review
I still
website.
do.
You still do. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And you've become one of the most sought after engineers for both live and studio work, which is incredible. And like like you're the kind of person I love, because I feel like I feel the same. Like for me, there is like this umbrella, which I have to say it is music for me. Like, but anything that happens under that umbrella, I'm kind of interested in learning about it, in kind of like even like doing it myself, in getting better at it. And because like I feel with the arts in general, I guess, but in music in particular, like the more you know about the process, the more you can enjoy it as well. You know, it
Absolutely.
unlike some of the prejudice that people have, that if you know too much about something that you will stop enjoying it. I think with music that's not the case. So tell us a little bit about your path. So how did everything start for you?
It started back in Italy, which is where I was living in the 90s. I was studying, I studied piano, and then I just became more and more interested in music, and it kind of became the center of my life. I listened to a lot of different things. I had a couple of friends that became musicians. Some became prominent musicians, and we're still in touch to this day. And then I was kind of I think I was around 16 when I was trying to figure out what to do with my life, and I didn't have a clear vision yet as to what to do with my life or in what direction to continue studying. And then a friend of mine, who I'm still friends with to this day, asked me if I knew anyone who wanted to buy his mixing console. And it was a large scale, a large format console, like, 2.5 meters long, 32 channels, I think, or 24, I forget, analog console, inline console. I was like, well, I'm not going to know anyone who has space or the money for that console. But then at night, the light bulb went on. I was like, maybe this is what I should be doing. So I bought the console and I built a recording studio in my parents' basement. And I went to his studio as an intern for a few months to learn the basics of recording and mixing. He was my earliest mentor. His name is Nanni Surace, and he's a studio called Pure Rock down in southern Italy. And that's how I started. I basically was recording at the time in the 90s in Italy. It was mostly punk hardcore. That was a big scene, especially in down south. And so I recorded tons of punk hardcore bands. I cut my teeth on that. And after about 2 or 3 years, it just, because of what you said to me, I feel the same. To me, music is a big umbrella. And although back then the umbrella was not as big and as wide as it is now for me, it was still bigger than just punk hardcore. In fact, I was really, as you said, I was running that music magazine called Chain DLK, which I still run to this day. It's been more than 25 years. It started in 1994. Um, so my interests musically were actually more towards electronic and industrial music, but there was no electronic or industrial music being made down south except for my band, which was called Memory Lab, which we made a record with back then. And so I just decided Southern Italy was too narrow in views. There wasn't enough diversity in music, and so I packed up and went to New York. Initially, to be fully honest, not with the intention of staying. Initially, I just went to New York thinking I'm going to go do an internship in a studio and learn to be a better engineer, and then maybe move back to Italy or to Switzerland or to northern Italy, open a studio. We'll see.
Hey,
But New York blew my mind and I stayed.
let me get the timeline right here. So when you got that first mixing desk that you bought, were you
Yeah.
still in your teens or were you already in your 20s?
No, I was in my teens. I think I was 17. I
Yeah.
think.
Hmm.
Um, I was 17. I was finishing up school. I was about to do at the time mandatory military service, which I opted out of in favor of what they call civilian service, which is the non weaponized pacifist version of it. So it was around that time. I was about 17 when I opened my first recording studio in my parents' basement, and then I ran it until I was about 20. And in 99, I moved to New York for an internship. I still kept a studio in Italy because my intention was to go back. And I even attempted to sublet it to some musicians that had recording interest in becoming recording engineers. That didn't really work out well. Um, but I basically kept the studio for another few years. And every time I would go back to New York, to Italy from New York, I would do sessions and then go back to New York and continue my internship.
Is
Uh,
is that is that house in Italy still part? Does it still belong to your family?
yeah, that's my parents' home, but
Hmm.
of course the studio isn't there anymore. It's
Hmm.
now my mother's sewing room. She makes clothes.
Very good. So New York blew your mind, right?
Oh
Um,
yeah, how can he not? It's the best city in the
no,
world.
yeah, yeah. I kind of agree. Like for me, it's Berlin for some other reasons, but like this whole and like especially in the arts or like in the business world in the greater sense, people do travel a lot, right? And people kind of like um, travel to where the opportunities are rather than waiting for opportunities to appear wherever you're based. And somehow, I mean, you're again, you're a prime example of that with the amount of traveling that you're doing. Or I don't know how COVID times were for you, but I think you must still have traveled during COVID times as well, right?
Yeah, I never really stopped except for the first 3 or 4 months when the world was trying to figure out what was happening.
Yeah, yeah. So what I'm interested in, like, so this this feeling of like going somewhere, being blown away by New York City. Like you already, like you made that one step, going somewhere else, and you're immediately like landing in that place that is sort of like your final destination. Not really, but in terms of where you're based, right?
Yeah.
And and so what was that like? Was that easy for you? Was that like, did you ever even like think about what you were doing? Was there any part of your life where there was like anxiety involved in being in a foreign country, in a big city like that, having to earn a lot of money to afford, to be able to live there and stuff like that?
Yeah. Well, actually, easy was not the word I would use at all. Those were the hardest years of my life, in order to make it work financially, because I wasn't making any money. When you do an internship, you don't earn any money, and I did that for 2 years. So in those 2 years, I had to live off of savings. And the way I was doing that, this were the early years of the internet, like you said at the beginning of this podcast. So I had an interest in web design. I still, have enough knowledge of web design that I can do all my web design, all my website I designed myself, the Chain DLK website I designed myself. So I know enough, but at the time I knew enough to sell that as a service. So I was, uh, being a web designer, which I could do from anywhere, creating websites for companies and things like that. And I was doing sessions in my studio in Italy every time I went back to Italy, and that's how I sustained myself throughout the first 2 years in New York. But the 2 years in New York were extremely hard because I had set myself based on the savings I had. I decided I had to make it work with $500 a month, which is absolutely inconceivable by today's standards. But 20 years ago, or almost 25 now, it was possible with a lot of sacrifices. Those sacrifices meant that I rented a house that was far away from the studio in a different state, actually, New Jersey. It also meant that, of course, I had roommates like everyone when you start out. But I was living in a shitty basement apartment that would flood every time it rained. So I had an inflatable mattress that I slept on, because that way, when it did rain, the inflatable mattress would float. Uh, I'm talking like, 2 centimeters of rain in the basement. It was like the most shitty and unhealthy thing, but that's all I could afford. And I wasn't, I was maybe too proud, you can say, to ask money to my parents. They had already helped me financially opening the studio, in their basement. So I didn't want to be a burden on them. So I never asked for money at home, and I just made it work. And it paid off. But interestingly, it was also, I mean, New York blew my mind on many levels, but it was also the first time, people don't know this, it was the first time I ever got on a plane. And it was the first time I ever went outside of Europe. Until then, I had only been to, within Europe, like things you can drive, like, Switzerland, of course. But so that was the first time I got on a plane and landed in the big city.
Oh, that's wonderful, man. It's actually giving me a little bit of goosebumps here. So cool. Hey, and let me
Yeah,
just go.
if I think, no, I was gonna say, if I think back on it, the fact it's so crazy the things we do in our 20s. If somebody told me now, okay, I'm 45 now. If somebody told me to get on a space shuttle and go to another planet and live in a cave because that's all I can afford, I don't know if I would do it. But when you're 20, you do it. You get on a plane, you go to a city you've never been to, that speaks a language that, I only had basic English from school. and you just made it work. And actually, Chain DLK, the magazine, for those who were listening to the podcast and don't know what it is, it's a music webzine now. At the time, it was a paper fanzine. Actually, helped me a lot because I had so many contacts in experimental music, industrial electronic, that when I first went to New York, I met this guy, and I'm ashamed to say I don't remember his name now, but he had a tape label, and we had been in touch for years. And he actually picked me up at the airport and drove me to his house and let me sleep on his couch for about 10 days until I found my first apartment. And that was through contact with music. So, and this is a guy I never met before. We were pen friends. This was, it was early days of the internet. So we had started as actual pen friends and evolved into email friends, but never met before. So
Yeah,
music has definitely been a connecting factor.
there are a lot of parallels between you and I there, and I think like it's not a surprise that I found your website, or like the website for the fanzine, or
Yeah.
in the mid 90s.
Yeah, I think the
And
first record I got from you was the Centro Zoom one, if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
yeah, and that was in 2000 actually.
That
So
was 2000.
that was 2000. But I'm pretty sure that we had been writing
What project
before.
did you have before Centro Zoom?
It was just a solo release that was called Taster, and an album
Okay.
with Ian Body that was in '99. So really, for me, things started. I had my first solo release in '98, '99 with Ian Body, and then Central Zone in 2000, and Europa String Choir in 2000. That was the beginning of my career, basically. And
Okay.
yeah, let me just go back a little bit. So how did uh, the idea to actually start a publication come into your mind at the age of what, 15 or something, right? Or uh,
Yeah, I was very young, 1994. I was born in 77. What's the math there? 87.
17, right?
Yeah, 17. 17 was really, if I look back in my life, 17 was the most formative year. It was the year in which I was most politically active. Now, now I don't believe in the good of people anymore. Back then, I believed you could change the world like all 17-year-olds do. So I was acting active politically in squats and like local art projects, trying to do things in southern Italy where there was nothing happening culturally speaking. Still to this day, it's culturally dead. Um, and so at 17, I realized that the music that I cared about, which was industrial electronic music, was not really, didn't have an audience in Italy. And so I decided to do this fanzine. I started it in 94 with the name of DLK, the letters, the three letters. And then, and it was, I was typing it on a Commodore 64 computer that my father owned, and I would print out the articles on on a matrix printer, and then cut them out and glue them on top of photocopied paper. So total, like, maximum rock and roll, do it yourself style, graphically speaking. That those were the fanzines back in the day, and then I would make photocopies of that. And the first edition, I remember I made 100 copies, and then from the second edition on, I started printing it like real in an offset printing center, and I forget how many copies, but then it eventually grew from that photocopied dot matrix printer style to a full color 50-page magazine with a CD enclosed, um, and eventually became Chain DLK because I joined forces with this guy called Maurizio Pustianaz, who was making music as Gerstein back then, still does. And he had a webzine called Chain the Door, and we just joined the two names, Chain the Door with DLK, and called it Chain DLK. But yeah, I mean, to answer your question more briefly, I just wanted to give an audience to that genre in a place where that genre was underrepresented, in my opinion. And so that's why I created it.
How did you distribute the copies of the fanzine?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, back then, there was a big underground scene made out of distributors, record labels, fanzine, do-it-yourself fanzine makers. All of these, it's hard to explain these days because in the pre-internet era, this all happened in person with mail and with concerts. So what would happen back then is you would go to a concert in the 90s, and at where today would be the merch table for the t-shirts and the CDs of the band. Back then there were merch tables of multiple distributors and multiple fanzine makers, etc., that would set out their stuff. And then most importantly, and here's the key, they would trade with each other. So I would give 5 copies of my magazine to another fanzine maker, and then I would do my own little merch table where I'd sell my magazine and the copies that I've gotten from that other person. And this network was at the very least nationwide, but it was really worldwide. So I remember, it's a funny note, for example, I'm sure most of your podcast listeners have heard of the great magazine called Tape-Op, which is Larry Crane and John Bacigalupi make out in Portland. Great, one of my favorite. Well, I actually got in touch with those guys back then, and at the time they were also within this network of fanzines, and we were exchanging copies where I would send them 5 copies to Portland and they would send me 5 copies to Italy. So I have the very first numbers of Tape Op, which now is a real full-blown magazine. Back then was a smaller version. It was not color. So we came from the same beginnings, and that kind of network existed pre-internet and was how you distributed. We spent so much money on mail and postage, like more money than printing the actual magazine, probably.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. How are your ties currently to Italy, and like, do you still what kind of status do you have in Italy? Do you even know? Like, do people
uh,
remember you? Do they admire you? Like, is
I
there
mean
any?
it I mean there obviously I have friends from that era. Some of them have continued making music. uh, Very few have made it. My best friend from childhood is now the most prominent guitar player in Italy. He is the arranger, producer, and guitar player for the biggest rock star in Italy. The name of the rock star is Vasco Rossi. My friend's name is Pastano, and Vince and I actually made a record together called "Past the Mark." Came out on a label called New Jazz a few years back, maybe 10 years ago. It's an electronic plus guitar record. Um, but obviously, the people of my generation remember me because we were friends. We were in the same concert scene. There's a new generation of people that know me as an engineer. And it's funny, I just yesterday got an email from somebody from Italy, actually from Puglia, which is the heel of the boot where I grew up, writing me in English and asking me to mix their record. So clearly they have no idea that I'm from there or have lived there. So, it's a mixed bag now of people that know me from back then, people that have heard my name after, unrelatedly. It's a big world now, joined by a big network, so it's easy to find people and reach out to people, and I'm very approachable. Anyone can and should email me on my website, and I answer everyone within 24 to 48 hours. But to answer your question, my ties with Italy are, musically speaking, not very strong, in the sense that I have not kept tabs on the scene in Italy. I'm kind of uninterested with Italian. Mainstream Italian music is terrible, just like mainstream American music. There are, of course, exceptions and great bands that come from Italy. But except for a few names here and there that I keep tabs on, I don't really follow the scene. I have some musician friends that are amazing, like Vincenzo Vasi or Enrico Gabrielli, who, funnily enough, I met through Mike Patton and his band Mondo Cane, because I'm the mixing engineer, front of house mixing engineer for Mondo Cane, which is Mike Patton's band that plays old Italian music from the 50s and the 60s. And that band has 12 members, out of which 8 or 9 are Italian. So it's funny that through Mike Patton, I actually met these Italian people that I otherwise wouldn't have met, which are incredible musicians. Henry Zavalloni is another one, keyboard player. So these people I'm friends with now, and I keep tabs on their projects. But short of that, I don't really look at Italy as a place of work. Of course, if somebody does reach out to me, I work with the Italians. But otherwise, my reach is mostly American and British because I live. I mean, I work
Yeah.
with people from all over the world, but I live between New York and London. So
So let me ask you something. Like there are many Italian families in New York City, right? Like there's a whole community, Italian community, most of which are kind of like, I guess generations removed from being real Italians, right? So
yeah,
in the
absolutely.
sense of speaking the language, right? So, but did you have any contact with New Yorker Italians that are is there has there any been no
No,
no
zero. I actually I made it. I specifically made it a point when I moved to the U.S. to not make any Italian friends, and I for different reasons. The primary reason is that I wanted to learn English, and I knew that if I stuck with the Italians, I would keep speaking Italian and not learn the language. But I also don't really like the your average typical Italian American that you're describing. They're
well
so far removed from what Italy is. They don't know the real Italy. They have this image of Italy which is from the 1950s, and they think that's the people that call mozzarella mousse. It's just not. It's we're from different worlds. We're from different eras, and so I don't really have much in common with them. I mean, it's not to say that they can't be nice people, but they just have a distorted vision of Italy, which is completely unrealistic.
No, I was just curious, and it's actually funny that you actually gave a good response here. Like, so, but I remember like when we first met, you were still, also using your second last name,
Yeah,
which do you remember when you dropped it? When
I
was
don't
that?
remember when I dropped it. It was just long and I was basically using my mother's last name, and I think at the time it was just it's nobody's ever brought that up with me. That's a good. You're like a psychologist poking at my past. I think it was partly my refusal of Italy. I've had a bit of a what's the word, an abrasive relationship with Italy, because living in Italy has made me resentful of Italy, because southern Italy was such a hard place to assert yourself or to find yourself. It's a place that it suffocates any creativity. It's a place that I absolutely despise as a place to live in. I love it now. I love going there on vacation. I even own my little place, so I can go in the summer, and I love the food, and the people are beautiful, and the beaches. All of that is great, but I would never, ever, ever want to live there. It's the death of creativity. It's the death of ambition. People there are have given up on life, and of course, with some exceptions, most people just don't are not ambitious, and that has always been the case, and made me resentful towards Italy, which is why I was using my father and my mother's last name together to assert myself as somebody that was more international than that Italian person living there. Um, and I also, I was always like more interested in what was going on beyond the borders of Italy, and I wanted to keep my connection with Switzerland, with Central Europe, which is where I grew up as a kid. So that's why I was using it. And then I think it just became complicated to use two last names, and I just dropped it at some point, but I don't remember when.
Yeah. I do have to ask this. So you said that like in Italy, like there's like the how did you say, death of creativity. You used many different words to like very strongly describe what you think is happening there, and I believe you. Okay, but how is that being accomplished? How has that kind of stance towards creativity found its way into the Italian culture? Because like my, if you want to know like what my observations are about Italian musicians, for example, right? Like, it, you could say like when you want to find the best guitarist in the world, let's say the best blues guitarist or the best jazz guitarist, like I say best in inverted brackets here, right? Or uh, the best equipped studio in the world. Like, you can say like with like a 99% chance you can find it in Italy. You can find that guy who knows how to play blues like just like anybody else in Italy. What I mean by that is that there seems this, and this maybe even like to what you were saying, there seems to be this, that a lot of like the individual Italian soul seems to not even be taken seriously, and like people always look beyond, like you were saying, maybe actually looking like, how can I be as good as this guy who is far away? And then there's like kind of like the motivation and the energy to actually practice a lot and to do a lot to actually get there. And this is something that I've always found like really fascinating about Italians, because they can be extremely dedicated and extremely um, positively busy. Yeah, I find. But then let's say the artistic soul is kind of like non-existent quite often.
I mean, I have to respectfully disagree with
Good,
you.
good.
I don't really. If I were looking for the best blues guitar player or jazz guitar player, I would not look in Italy.
But
Uh,
that's why I use the inverted commas.
yeah, no, I mean, I would. First of all, it's like looking for the best sushi restaurant in Italy. It just, the best sushi restaurants are in Japan. That's where sushi is from. There's good ones else in other places, but I wouldn't look in Italy in the same way I would not look for music like jazz and blues, which is from America. I wouldn't start looking
In
for
Germany.
that in Germany or in Italy.
Yeah.
We can talk about the best pizza and the best coffee, and that's you're going to find in Italy. And I actually, funnily, I have this conversation with Americans when they're like, "Oh, the best pizza in the world is here in New York." It's like, you have no idea. You've never even been to Italy. Go to Italy, and then let's have that conversation. So I am all for authenticity and for looking out for authenticity, searching out authenticity. Um, I mean, I agree that there are great musicians in Italy, but like I said, they're content. They don't have ambition. They complain about Italy. They complain about how things don't work in Italy, but then they stay in Italy. And I can't really comprehend that or relate to that. That's why I left. In Italy there's a term that they call it fuga dei cervelli, which means the escape of the brains, which means basically if you have a brain, you're going to escape. Or it basically refers to how people that have ambition and want to do things have to leave because you can't do them in Italy. And there's people who try to do them in Italy. There's people who are content with doing whatever they do in Italy. But there isn't the same opportunity. I mean, look at me now. I'm an accomplished engineer. I work with the best of the best musicians in the world. Could I have achieved that from Italy? I don't think so. You have to be in a place like New York where you can be exposed to a certain level of musicians and level of people to end up working with people like John Zorn and Nick Cave and U2. I don't think I would have been able to do that from Italy. Yes, there are a few exceptions that have achieved good careers in Italy, but it's just normal that if you're in Italy, you're going to be limited to the Italian market, and it's going to be very hard to go past the geographical borders of that.
So am I right in assuming that you would say that you like that fuga, that escape, that you were doing that?
Yeah, I was. I don't know if I was conscious at the time. I wasn't actually because I didn't even live Italy with the intention of leaving Italy. Like I said, I went to New York to do an internship with the intention of returning to Europe. But obviously, yes, I'm part of that fuga.
Hmm. And
But it's the
which,
best decision I've ever made. I'll say that.
yeah. So while you were there in the basement with lots of water under you, and you went and interned at that studio. Which studio was that?
It was the same studio that I run and operate to this day. It was Eastside Sound, which is a studio that Lou Holtzman opened in 1972, the year you were born in. So as you know, it's almost 50 years old, or actually, it's 50 years old this year. The studio, and it's a studio that was very prominent in the jazz world. So I got to record a lot of jazz, which is how I got in plugged into the jazz scene here in New York. And I started there, pouring coffee for clients, cleaning the toilets, scrubbing the floors. Eventually, I upgraded to running cables, breaking down sessions, setting up sessions. It was a steady ascent over the course of several years. I'm now the chief audio engineer, and the manager of the studio. And I have all my gear in that studio. So now I have a Neve console, a ton of microphones, speakers, and I keep everything at that studio. Uh, and so it's my home base now. But Lou Holtzman is still the owner.
Hmm. Mark, this conversation is really fascinating to me because you are like on one hand, like you're describing, and I know you personally, so I know what kind of like drive you have also to be in, let's say, almost like you want to be in different places at the same time, right? You're
I
that kind of
wish.
person. But like in your life, there seems to be like this major event, which is you leave Italy and you get to New York, and like you have this amazing stability, like almost 25 years later. You're basically living the American dream in the sense you start as an intern, you sleep on the wet floor, and you become the main, well, one of the main guys in that studio over this time. And having that stable base, you're still following your dream to move around and to like I said, you're still following the opportunities that are not. It's like what I'm trying to say is you have not become lazy, right?
No.
Even though
Well,
even though you have like that stability.
absolutely. Well, I'm not interested in complacency, and I'm not interested in being static. I love, variety is the spice of life. I've always said that. So for me, that applies to musical genres, which is why I don't want to be pigeonholed in one genre. I work within different genres. I go to tons of different concerts, and variety is the spice of life in pretty much everything. Anyone would get bored doing the same thing forever. So why put myself in a position to do just one thing or be just in one place when I can do multiple things and be in multiple places and go to multiple concerts? Yesterday I flew back from Europe. I landed at 2 p.m. and at 7:30 I was checking out a new opera at Park Avenue Armory in New York City. It's like, yes, I could have stayed home and napped and fallen asleep jet lagged, but I chose to go out and experience life because that's a better way to live than being complacent and at home.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm really wondering if your time in Italy really traumatized you quite a bit. Huh? It sounds like it,
It
right?
probably
Yeah.
did. I mean, Italy, I felt Italy to me was like a jail I needed to escape from.
Yeah, I'm
Uh,
sorry to hear that, man.
well, a bit, but I also I didn't really know that at the time. I mean, I know that now, that I felt like a jail. Well, I mean, I did know it when I was 16, 17. I knew I didn't, I felt like a fish out of water. But, I had my friends and I had my network and et cetera, et cetera. But I'm glad I escaped. I would have been miserable if I had stayed there.
So I think like from all the great people you've met, like one person that stands out to me historically is Lou Reed, actually, as somebody you've worked with. So how did that come about, or maybe even tell us more generally, like saying after you've done your internship, kind of like what was the series of events that led to you meeting these uh, historically important figures?
Well, everything was gradual. Nothing happened. There was no one event that changed everything. Everything happened gradually, and everything happened basically through word of mouth, in the sense that I met Lou Reed through Laurie Anderson, whom I saw yesterday at the opera I just mentioned, and I met Laurie Anderson through John Zorn. And if I think further back, as I'd have to think how I met John Zorn. I don't remember exactly, but I think I met John Zorn through Bill Laswell. So it's all like, if I have to look back at the origins, it's all one thing led to another, and over the course of many years, nothing happened. I didn't win the lottery suddenly. It's just been very, very, very gradual, and it's still gradual to this day. Every day you meet somebody new, which then you stay in touch with, and eventually, you know, ends up leading to another project down the line. But yeah, I mean, the short version of Lou Reed is I met Zorn. I've been working with Zorn for almost 15 years by now. I've recorded over 120 records of John Zorn's music, which I think is a Guinness World of Book of Records right there. And then someday Zorn introduced me to Laurie, because Laurie was looking for an audio engineer for her tour. That was at the time of Homeland, I think 2008. So I went on tour with Laurie, and then on tour with Laurie, I met Lou, who used to sit right next to me at the first gig I did with Laurie. Lou sat right next to me at front of house, and everyone was afraid for me because they thought he would yell at me, but instead he was extremely pleased and impressed with the mix, and so he kind of stole me away from Laurie. Um, I finished the tour with Laurie, and then Lou hired me for his tour, and I worked with him for the last 7 years of his life.
Yeah, what you just said, that everything is kind of like comes together gradually. That is really a very big. Like for me, I think it always was obvious, but that's how life works and how careers work. Um, but then like some people have this idea that you do win the lottery, right? That there is like this overnight. Um, no, no.
No, nothing is overnight. Absolutely not. I mean, the only big thing that happened in my life from a musical standpoint was winning the Grammy Awards in 2005 for the Les Paul record. That was that was one event that was like major, and that in a way changed things. But it didn't change. It's not like the next day the phone started ringing. I mean, the next day everything was just the day before I won those Grammys. The only difference is that when the phone rang, I could say that I won those Grammys, and that would instill confidence in people, knowing that they were in the hands of somebody capable. So the Grammy Awards didn't necessarily bring more business. They just let people know that they were in good hands.
Yes. Yeah.
It's just a business card in a sense.
It's wow, 2005. I still remember when you got that when you
Yeah, that
earned
was a
that.
long time ago.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. So let's just say, like, in terms of your work, your technical work as an engineer.
Hmm.
Um, or maybe we can kind of like draw this together a little bit. How do you see the development of your way of working over the years? Have you like always, like, from the initial days with that desk at your parents' house? How has your approach, or even how has your listening changed over the years?
I mean, from a technical point, of course, it changed enormously, especially because I started with tape machines. My first multi-track, my very first experiments were with two cassette players. So I would literally like the Beatles started. I would record onto one cassette, then I would play that cassette into a mixer, play an instrument on top of that, take the output of the mixer, go to another cassette player. That's how I did my first overdubs. Then I was like, this is stupid. Why use three machines when I can use one? So I bought a Fostex X26, which was a four-track multi-track recorder on cassette tapes, little cassette tapes. So I experimented with that. And then when I opened the studio, I went to a different format. It was an Akai format that recorded 16 tracks, well, 14 tracks actually, because two were control tracks. One was a Synthi track on like these things that looked like VHS tapes, but they were not VHS. And then from there, I went to, reel to reel, Fostex. No, I forget. I think Fostex. Anyway, a reel to reel machine was my first 16 track tape recorder. So obviously, once I went to New York and I saw Pro Tools, my mind was blown. I remember the first time I was, excuse me, the first time I was in a session at East Side Sound, watching the engineer Lou Holtzman punch the whole band on Pro Tools, do a punching, which in the time of tapes you couldn't do because you would hear, the music interrupt. So that blew my mind. I was like, wow, you can, with this thing you can punch the whole band, not just the singer. And I was like, okay, I gotta buy Pro Tools. So I bought Pro Tools for my studio in Italy, which I ended up never using because at the I ended up staying in New York. But my from a technical point of view, of course, it changed enormously from those early days. From a listening point of view, it changed my way of working. Uh, became more focused on acquiring good sounds from the get-go rather than trying to uh, change them, morph them into something better after acquisition. I would say that's the biggest change. I remember in my early days on the console in Italy, in my parents' basement, recording a band, and then I remember soloing every single instrument and EQing the shit out of it, trying to make it sound better. But I realized later on with time and experience that what I was doing is I was focusing on one tree of the forest rather than the forest as a whole. And that was an important revelation and change in approach. So now I don't do that anymore. I don't solo every single instrument trying to make it sound perfect on its own. I try to make that instrument work within the forest of those trees. Um, and I make sure that I record it properly from the beginning. Like rather than say, I don't have I'll fix it in the mix attitude. I'll fix it in the recording so that in the mix I can just mix and not fix. And that's been the biggest change in my approach, I would
Yeah,
say.
and that's great, and it's sort of like the luxury of having a like a world class room at your disposal in which you can record, right? Or
Absolutely. I mean, the room is extremely important, and the room makes a big difference, much bigger than people think. People don't realize because there's this assumption that you can buy a microphone and you can do a professional recording at home. But it's not true because there's still a preamp and there's still a room in which that microphone is placed, and people don't understand that. Everything counts and everything is part of the equation.
yes, yeah, and it's that kind of luxury really hasn't been well. It is part of my life when I afford to go to a studio to work in, but like in my general musician's life, still, I sometimes have to work with less than ideal signals, which which then leads to like for me leads to, as you say, like fix it later kind of approach. But it's not that it's intentional; it's necessary, and like for me, that's why I had Cool Edit Pro in the mid '90s. I don't know if you remember that software.
Yeah, I never used it, but I remember the name of it.
It was on one of the first softwares that had like a denoising function where you could take a noise print, and then and that has become sort of like ever since like a lifesaver, like that in my DNA. I kind of like know, okay, if I get shitty signals, I know how to repair them, and and like having a studio at your disposal at such a young age, coming into a professional recording studio and having the opportunity to gather all that experience in that. Well, I know that you're also working in other studios, but like this consistency, the stability to actually work in that one environment, like it's no wonder, like to me, that you have gotten successful relatively quickly. Like if we're thinking about it, like the Les Paul record, like 2005, so that was only like 3-4 years after your internship, right?
Yeah, almost 6. I started my internship in 99. So it wasn't that quick, but you could say it's quick. But that was, I think that was being in the right place at the right time, and being able to prove your worth. Because when I first went to the studio, like I said, I started scrubbing toilets and making coffee, but I showed them that I knew what I was doing, because I had already had a studio in Italy. And once they figured out that I was reliable and that I was consistent and good in my work, they started giving me more jobs. So when the Les Paul tribute record started being happening at East Side Sound, I was already in a position where I was doing a lot of the sessions, and so it helped to be there. It helped for them to know that I was reliable. That's how I got hired on that project.
Yeah. So from your, I know you've worked with some famous producers as well, right? Um, what is like the what is it like to be working with a great producer as an engineer?
Well, actually, what I learned on that very record, the Les Paul record, it was a formative experience. But it was the first time that I worked with a producer, Bob Cottarella, and it was the first time that I realized I had to keep my mouth shut. And even though my opinion was different than Bob's, it wasn't the right place or time for me to express that opinion. And I made some mistakes in assuming that my opinion mattered, or that they care about my opinion. So I learned that back then, that when you're the engineer, you're hired to make sure everything is recorded properly and sounds properly and is mixed properly, but you're not hired to contribute your artistic opinion to anything. So that was a good learning experience from that sense. And obviously, then it depends on the relationship you have with the producer. In the last uh, 10 years, I worked a lot with Hal Wilner, who was a mentor to me. Sadly, he passed away 2 years of COVID. He was one of the early COVID victims. Um, and with Hal, I had a much more fluid um, relationship, and there was a lot of trust going both ways. So, he would ask me, "What do you think?" And I would give him my opinion, or I could say, "What do you think about this?" It's different, but you have to get there. You have to build up to that point where you can offer your opinion or a suggestion, so that you it doesn't look like you're overstepping your role as an engineer in the producer versus engineer relationship.
Hmm. So how are you dealing with like having an initial session with a new producer, say, where you really don't know what their tastes are, what kind of microphones they want to use? Like how do you approach that? Are you kind of like offering the options, and or are you setting something up and then you just see how it works for them, or like what's your approach there?
I mean, the communication is the most important thing. So when I speak to an engineer, sorry, to a producer, I ask them if they have any preferences or how they want to do certain things. I don't really ask them about microphones, because I think that's part of my job. And in the same way where I shouldn't offer them artistic opinions because they're the producers, I don't think they should tell me what microphones to use because I'm
Very
the
good.
engineer.
Very good. Yeah.
So
Hmm.
so I'm going to pick my own microphones, and if they have a problem with it, we can discuss and change. But that's part of my job, and the more important thing is the approach to the session. Obviously, if it's the first time I'm working with somebody, I'm very respectful, um, and I don't say anything. I just ask them what they want to do, how they want to do it. I remember one of the early sessions with Hal Wilner. I assumed, because Hal makes a lot of, it was a rock record we were doing. I assumed that Hal would want to have the drums in the live room, but the assumption was wrong. So had I discussed that previously, I could have figured that out. But Hal was also one of those people that it was hard to get answers from before a session. He was very much, a spur of the moment kind of guy. So we just moved the drums into a room, into an ISO booth, because he wanted to have all the musicians in the main room, so he could sit in the main live room with the musicians. But every producer is different, so communication is key. That's how you find out what to do.
This, yeah, communication is key. Was that something that you learned in the studio then, would you say, like in practice, or was that something you were gifted with already? That kind
I
of,
mean, communication is key in general in the world.
yes,
It's not only about studios.
of course.
It's key with everyone. With your partner. If you don't talk, you're gonna create a weird situation where one is wondering what the other one thinks. So communication is key for everyone everywhere in the world, and I just apply the same in the studio. What's different in the studio maybe is that from communication comes preparation. So if you communicate and you have a clear uh, and you have clear information, then you can act on that information and prepare. So if I know what's coming, I can prepare for that, and I can, make sure that I'm ready for any curveball that's thrown at me. With, Hal Wilner, for example, there were always curveballs, because Hal was such a spur of the moment guy that he would always decide to change something last minute. So if he told me we're gonna do a string trio, I would set up 4 string microphones and 4 headphones and 4 music stands, because so if he decided to add a fourth string player, I was already ready.
Hmm.
That kind of over preparation is something that I've learned is key in work when working with somebody you don't know, or somebody that can change their mind easily, or somebody that's very, gets inspired by the moment.
So that also means you're always the first in the studio and you're the last to leave, right?
Absolutely. Especially when I'm working with a producer, I definitely get there early. But in general, I mean, now I have assistants working for me, so I can, if I'm doing a session, I just tell them what to set up and how to set it up. But I'm still very precise as to what microphone, what preamp, where to place the instrument, so that when I get there, and I still get there before the artist gets there or the producer, I can just reposition the microphones the way I want them and get going.
Hmm. And I know that you're a big fan of recording like a full band in the studio, right? Like a live in the studio kind of setting, right? And with I'm just guessing here, but I would say, I guess that in quite a few of the albums you're making, they're pretty quick, um, pretty quick turnaround. Like recording makes almost kind of like it's happening as one, um, yeah, as one project, right? Like there's no separation really, and you're very quick at turning these projects around, and like
Yeah,
with,
it depends on the project. I mean, the
of course,
some records take a long time. The Les Paul record took 5 months. The Angel Headed Hipster tribute to Mark Bolan and T Rex that I did with Hal Wilner took 4 years. Obviously not continuously. But when I do a jazz record, then it's more like what you're describing. The turnaround is 2 or 3 days. We usually do 1 or 2 days of tracking, and then a day of mixing. For a jazz record, that's definitely possible.
hmm,
All of these records you see here, and there, these white ones are all
yes,
records of a label called Nouvelle Records, which is a French and American jazz label that I work with, which does high quality vinyl, analog vinyl recordings. And those were all done in 2 or 3 days at the most. 1 or 2 days of track. Also, the Zorn records, I've done 120 records with him or more. Those were all 1 or 2 or 3 days. Well, 1 or 2 days of tracking and 1 or 2 days of mixing at the very most. So never takes more than 4 days for one of those jazz records.
Hmm. So what does the mixing process then look like? Like, say you do your best, as you say, to capture everything as um, perfectly as you can for the sound that you want. Um, what like, because you could say that, like, that the recording, or the, running a 2 track from the recording session could already be the record in some cases, right? So how does the mixing, what does it look like? Is it like the traditional way where you would then start uh, compressing and EQing signals, or like in most cases, I guess you wouldn't want to touch um, the tracks too much, right? Or like, how do you
Yeah, I
handle
mean,
this?
I do like to keep things separate. I'm not a fan of mixing while recording because if you, I mean, obviously it has its advantages, but if you mix while you're recording, you're focusing uh, on the mix only to make sure you're not missing any detail. But you don't have, you have to kind of keep a part of your mind available to listen to the performance, um, so that if somebody wants to do an overdub, you know where you are in the song and you're not distracted by the fact that in that moment you're raising a guitar solo, a guitar fader, because the guitar was doing something interesting, you know. So I do like to keep the separate mindsets and do it on separate days. I also think it's very important for your ears to stay fresh, to be able to start a mix with fresh ears. So that's why I prefer to do it, to not start a mix while I'm recording or after I'm recording on the same day. I prefer to do it the next day.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
that's interesting. So, like, this is what I would refer to as a passive mix. Like, so, like, during the recording, you wouldn't really want to touch the faders too much, because you just set up that one sound where you can make sure you're able to hear what the performance is like.
yeah,
and
exactly.
and
I want to
mhm,
be able to focus on the performance, and obviously, I'm keeping an eye on all the preamp levels, because that's the most important thing when you record, is to make sure you're not distorting on anything, because there's no way of going back with that. Uh, and then I'm also not a big fan of doing a lot of compression during the recording. I tend to keep it to a minimum. I don't do any EQing during recording. In my opinion, if you want a different EQ on something while recording, you should just change the mic or reposition the mic, because you can achieve all of that with proper mic selection, proper mic positioning. Um, so once it's all recorded and it's recorded properly with the right microphones from the right distance at the right angle and the right preamp, then your mix becomes a lot easier, because those decisions that you made during the tracking portion of it affect how your signals will translate in the mix. So, yes, I'm not doing mixing while recording, but I am doing mixing while recording, because I'm making choices that affect the way the mix will be
exactly,
handled.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. Again, that's the luxury of being there for the whole of the process, of being kind of responsible for
Yeah, I
the whole
like
thing.
to record and mix my own records. There are definitely records that I only mix. People send me stuff from all over the world to mix. And sometimes, very rarely, I record things that somebody else is mixing. But in general, I do prefer to record the things I'm going to mix, because then I know they're recorded properly.
So do you like, sometimes, do you like to get creative at the mixing stage? Like, and what? Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I love creativity, but again, communication is important. So you have to know that the artist wants you to be creative, because if you're being creative, you're sort of acting like a producer. So you have to make sure that there isn't another producer, or that either the artist or the producer wants you to come up with things that are creative because they're seen as an artistic suggestion. um, so communication is key. But yeah, if I have free reign, I love to be creative. I mean, that's the fun part.
So if there's anything, say, in a musical arrangement, let's say, where your opinion that maybe you're not voicing it, you're not saying what your opinion is, but something that is not working well for you, right? And you are not in the producer seat, but also there is no real producer. So you're the mixing engineer. So would you take on the task to try to make that thing work? That
It depends.
isn't
It
it?
depends on the relationship I have with the artist. If I feel like the artist is somebody I can suggest something, I will ask, "Do you mind if I, adjust this, or do you mind if we try this in a different way? Are you open to hearing it this way?" Communication again. It all depends on the relationship you have. If I'm being sent a track by somebody famous, I'm not going to start messing with things unless they specifically say so.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah. No, it's interesting because like I had a conversation with a classical music producer, and it was just fascinating, like all the weight that is on his shoulders. Like he's engineering and producing, right? And so like every single decision that you make from the get go, as you say, and that's kind of like your approach as well, is kind of like it's almost like a domino effect. Like if there's like a wrong decision at any point, like it can be quite a problem later on, and that's why I was asking, like, because I believe that a certain kind of producer's mind, it's kind of impossible to avoid if you're working as an engineer. I think like that distinction. I know what you're saying, and you're absolutely right. The distinction comes from the fact, like, how do we communicate, right? And who has which responsibility, right? But in a way, like like no matter what you do, even if you're working if you're working in a factory and you need to you need to do a certain task, you will come up with your own solution to problems. Yeah.
Yeah,
And that's why I think, especially with something as malleable as music, there's always, like, it's unavoidable that the stamp of, okay, Marc Urselli recorded this, or Marc Urselli mixed this. There's always going to be your perspective in those pieces of art, right? It's not that just because there's some other producer that the engineer doesn't count anymore, right?
absolutely. Well, I mean, the engineer's imprint is definitely, it's definitely important and can be heard. It might not be recognized, but it definitely is heard.
Okay, maybe so. Let's as a last chunk of things to talk about. Um, which Tell me about your musical projects and what you have put out in the past 20 years or so.
Yeah, I've not been very active, so that's going to be a short chunk, but I do have some things coming up. So I mentioned earlier in this interview about the Memory Lab. That came out about 10 years after the band actually existed. So it came out in the early 2000s on a label called D-Trash, a Canadian electronic industrial label. Then there was um, Past the Mark, which was my duo record with Vince Pastano, the famous guitar player in Italy I mentioned. That came out on New Jazz Europe. Um, Most recently, in the last 3 years, I made two records with a quartet. I played bass and keys in a quartet composed by myself, Jim Jarmusch, the film director who plays guitar, Lee Ronaldo of Sonic Youth, also on guitar, and Balázs Pandi, who's a Hungarian drummer. We made two records, and they came out on the Austrian label Trost. The last one just came out last May. Um, I have a lot of projects in the pipeline. Some of them, because I'm an engineer and I work with other people. My stuff always gets put back on the back burner and comes out last. So it takes me a long time to finish things. But I am working on a lot of things in the background in my spare time, which unfortunately is very little, or fortunately. One of the most important things, and that I'm most excited about, will actually hopefully come out this year, depending on the vinyl manufacturing delays. Um, it's a record called Steppendoom, and it's a project I've been working on for 10 years, which basically combines doom metal musicians from the Western Hemisphere with throat singers from the Eastern Hemisphere. So I have throat singers from Tuva, Mongolia, and Siberia. Throat singing, for those who don't know, is a technique of creating overtones with your vocal cords, so you sing multiple tones at one time. It's a Asian, Far East technique that I've always admired. I always wanted to incorporate, and I always thought it would work really great with doom metal. Very, very slow, sludgy metal. So I played drums and bass on this record. I wrote the tunes. I got the guitar players or musicians. There's great musicians from prominent doom metal bands like Neurosis, High on Fire, Sleep, Mr. Bungle, etc., etc. There's a lot of members from those bands, and then all the best throat singers that I could find. People like Hunurtu, Alash Ensemble, like really great, fantastic throat singers. I'm not going to talk about what label or what date because the label hasn't announced it yet, but I do have a label, and they're making this. We're working on this gorgeous, beautiful box set that's going to have a book and a vinyl and a 7-inch and a CD. And the book has photographs of Tuva in Mongolia that are beautiful, like worthy of a National Geographic spread, basically. And so it's going to be a very beautifully packaged release, and I'm very proud of that one. And if if time is on our side, it'll come out at the end of this year at some point.
Wow, wonderful! Like I can't wait to hear that. Like
Yeah, it's very unique. It's really amazing. But I have so many other projects in the works. Like, I was before COVID, I was starting a record with Blixa Bargeld of Einstürzen und Neubauten. We did a few sessions together, and
yeah,
it
you
we had
told me about that. Yeah, how is that
yeah.
going? Is that Do you think that will continue
I
somehow?
mean, it's been stopped, and I was just, as you know, I was just in Berlin for 3 hours yesterday, and I actually texted Blixa to see if he wanted to just have a coffee, but he said to me that he wasn't going out. I think he's being very careful with COVID because they also have a tour coming up with the Neubauten. So who knows? I mean, I do want to finish it, but it's going to require me going back to Berlin and and stuff. There were so many things in the works. I also wanted to do something with Mark Lanigan. We talked about it, and sadly, he passed. Uh, so there's a lot of things. I have another record that's on the back burner with Japanese musicians that I start working on, but then temporarily shelved because I wanted to finish Steppendoom. Steppendoom has taken me more than 10 years. That's how slow I've been. I'm ashamed of saying that, but that's when the first sessions happened. But then COVID helped me because once I was at home without sessions and without tours, I was like, this is the time to finish this record. And I really focused on it and finally finished it. So if it wasn't for COVID, it might have taken me another 5 years.
I have to laugh about Steppendoom. It's it's great because like I have a project also with Radik of Hunua too. Like
Oh, okay.
it's called
I,
Stepscape, but Steppendoom is awesome. Such an awesome name.
I didn't know you had a project with Radik. Tell me about
Yeah.
that.
Well, it's a long story. Like in like 2011, I met this singer Namgar, female singer, at a
Uh-huh.
festival in Russia, and made a record with her in 2012. And then we started this, had this idea for like a world music, like more of a potentially popular world music group that we put together with some Siberian singers and a Russian folk singer, and it was basically just like you could say groove based ambient scapes with the singers singing their traditional pentatonic tunes on top of
Oh wow,
the
that's
sound.
awesome.
Yeah, we did that a few times. We played in
Who was the
Kazakhstan.
Who was the Siberian artist?
There's Namgar. She's
Oh,
from she's from
Siberian.
Buryatia. Yes, yeah, and Tuva is also in Siberia. So Radik is
Yeah,
also technically from Siberia. Yeah, so
right.
it was three singers, and yeah, I mean, I really can't wait to hear that. That's like the idea to combine it with like sludgy metal is such a such a wonderful idea.
Yeah, I mean they go so well together, in my opinion, and nobody's
Yeah,
ever done it. So you know,
yeah, yeah.
but
You
I'd
know,
love to hear your stuff too. I mean, I have a couple of Siberian artists on that record too. I'd love to
mhm.
hear what you guys did.
Yeah. Well, I'll send you a link to that. Hey, and yeah, just one last flattering thing for you. Like one of my favorite recordings of the recent years is the one that you did for Schooley and Bill Frisell.
Oh
The
yes,
yeah.
that's a lot of people's favorite record, and it's one of my favorite records too. And it's
Mhm.
funny because people compliment me so often with that record, but it was such a easy record from a technical standpoint. I think it was 3 microphones.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
think that's just a testament to how less is more.
Mhm.
Um, and it's just, I mean, I'm not even going to try and pat myself on the back and say I did such an awesome job. All I did is choose the 3 mics that I thought worked the best and put
Mhm.
them in front of those musicians. And then you have these incredible musicians. That's why it sounds so good, because they're so amazing.
Was
Uh,
it recorded at East Side?
yeah, it was recorded at Eastside
Mhm.
many years ago.
Mhm.
uh, on that label that I showed you, this I can probably find it. It's, yeah, here it is. No, that's not it. Anyway, it's one of these white ones,
Yeah.
because that's the format of that label,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
they make these. I'll pull one out just to show you. Um, they make these white vinyls, 180-gram vinyls, and then they put them in these box sets, and it's a vinyl only label. So the way that it's a subscription based business model, which means that now they're changing that, but back then you could only subscribe to the label, and then you would get 6 vinyls in the course of a year, one every 2 months, and you could only buy the subscription to the full package for the year. Again, now that's changing, so now you can buy individual records, but at the time you could only buy 6 at a time for the year, and you wouldn't even be told what you were getting. You would kind of trust the label with the curating. One of those records was the Schooley Sverrisson and Bill Frisell record. So the label knew Bill Frisell. They didn't really know Schooley. I'd worked with Schooley through Laurie Anderson many years prior, good friends with Schooley, so I suggested Schooley. The duo came out fantastic. It was one of the quietest sessions, because if you know Schooley and Bill, you know that they both speak very quietly, and they're very like in awe of each other. And so it was a very quiet session with a lot of awkward silences. The music did all the talking, and the music was incredible. But I'm digressing. What I was trying to say is that the label had a business model where they had exclusive rights over the album for 2 years. And so that record was actually released 4 or 5 years ago, but only on vinyl,
Mhm. Yeah.
and wasn't available in any other format. After those 2 years, then the record was released as a digital download, and maybe a CD too. I forget if they printed CDs of that. So now the world is finally hearing it and it's a beautiful record. But yes, I mean, both of those guys are such incredible musicians. I just hired Schooley to be a curator on a series of concerts that I did in Iceland at Sigur Ros's studio, um, which came out fantastic. Schooley did one of the concerts, and these concerts are slowly being released one at a time on YouTube. Um, so I don't know when you will release this podcast, but we're now in March. Sometimes in the next 1 or 2 months, you will see Schooley doing a solo concert from the Siguro studio that I produced and engineered. And I think there's even maybe one piece from that record.
I'm impressed about all the things that you do. And hey, I just do you remember Mo Boma?
I don't think so.
It's one of the early projects that Schooley had in the early 90s.
Oh
Um,
wow,
you need to check that out. Mo Boma, Mobomo, or Boma. Um,
no Boma.
yeah,
You
I
know,
thought I thought you would know this.
it's very funny because no, I don't know Mo Boma. I'm looking it up on Wikipedia. It's funny because I first heard of Schooley through Chain DLK. Uh, he had a record on Extreme um, called, I believe, Ceremonies. If my mind is, yes, Ceremony with an S. 1997 came out on the label Extreme, and the label Extreme at the time was sending me CDs to review. So they sent me this CD, and I was so impressed by the fact that all these electronic sounds were exclusively being made by the bass. So it's a solo bass CD, but you would think that there's a ton of other instruments and samplers and things like that, but it's all made with the bass. And that, I remember, blew my mind. Um, so I always remembered the name Schooley Sverrisson since 1997, but never had any dealings with it. Then in 2008, I met Schooley through Laurie Anderson. We went on tour together for a year. One of those, during that tour, one of those concerts was in Bari in southern Italy, which is an hour away from where my parents live, where my studio was. And so I said, if you guys are into it, my mom makes a killer lasagna. Uh, and so I called my mom and I said, can you make lasagna for like 10 people? We're going to come over before or after the concert. I forget. And we rented a little van from the airport and we drove down an hour and a half to my parents' house. So it was me, Schooley, Lou Reed, Laurie Anderson, Peter Scherer, at the time was the keyboard player, um, lives in Switzerland now. I forget who else was that night. There were a bunch of crew members, like the lighting designer. Anyway, we all went to dinner at my mom's and my parents to have these amazing lasagnas. And I picked up the magazine with the review of Schooley Sverrisson's record, and I showed it to Lou. And I remember my English was not so great in the review because at the time I just had very basic English. But Lou was like, I remember Lou said something like, "Oh, no wonder Zorn likes you so much. You were doing this in 1995. It's incredible," or it's 98, whatever it was. So it came full circle with Schooley from getting that ceremony CD to having Schooley over for dinner, and then we became friends through the years. We stayed in touch. He's in Iceland, doing lots of interesting projects, and this last one we just did together, like I mentioned, will come out very soon on YouTube.
Wonderful. Hey, my friend, that was awesome. Awesome to check. To catch up after a couple of years.
Yeah, it's been a while. It's been a minute. Last time I saw you was in Berlin, right?
Yeah, that was like 3 years ago, I guess.
Oh, it feels longer, but everything
I
feels
think it was.
longer. But
Yeah, I think it was only 3 years. Okay, my friend, this was fantastic. Like only an hour and 20 minutes, and like we covered so much. Incredible.
thank you for having me.
Yes, and yeah, have a great time back home, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thank you,
Yeah,
Marcus.
bye bye.
Good luck.